One of the things that people were concerned about going into lockdown was the issue of domestic violence, and that gender-based violence was going to increase, in the country. And in fact, it has. By all measures, the stats are telling us that there are people who are struggling. Normally, gender-based violence increases during the weekends between Friday and Saturday, because then people go out drinking and they come and abuse those they love in their homes. And now that people are on lockdown, people find themselves essentially trapped in a house with people who are abusive, And so during lockdown, one of the things I was reading, part of also what I was thinking about was just the books around masculinity, and I just completed reading this book, I and John, and I'm not quite sure what to make of this book, but I'm going to just try and share a few ideas. So we find ourselves in this situation where there's gender-based violence, and we know that in South Africa this is a big problem, a huge problem. In other parts of the world, people are inventing spaceships, and people are talking about just inventing electric cars and just doing something different. And in South Africa, we have to focus on women being raped and women being abused, and it's just a terrible thing. And so a lot of us then are starting to think, but hang on, what is the problem? And I have personally been on shows, and we'd be talking about toxic masculinity, and every second day, every day, in fact, you see a show dedicated to some issue about women and children being abused. And so my mind was there, so hence I started reading this book. I bought this book about 4 years ago, and I finally got to read it, about I and John, Men and Masculinity by Robert Bly. In fact, the reason why I wanted to read this book is that when I was speaking to people, they said that it's quite a silly book to read, because it's got ideas that are not helpful to the feminist movement, and in fact they made me more curious. And so I had a couple of ideas and questions. One of the questions was, is there a time in history where men were good? Because if things are so terrible now, is there a time in history where men are good? And people struggle to answer that. I asked a few people that question, and some people just said never. There's never been a time in history where men are good. So then I began to ask, then are little boys born evil? Are little boys born wired to commit vile acts, or is it that there's something that happens in society that changes beautiful little boys into people who abuse? And the other thing I noticed was, what is then the definition of a good man? How does a good man behave? So I started asking people, friends and people in the space who deal with manhood issues and masculinity. I asked, so what is a good man? And people struggle to answer that question as well. You could easily find 1,000 people who tell you what's wrong with men, what's bad about men, and you'd struggle to find 5 in a room to tell you what is a good man, the portrait of a good man. So I had these questions going in to read this book, and as I was reading this book, a couple of things came up. So Robert Bly starts off with a story about there was a land, not to spoil the book, but there was a place, and in this place had this king, and this king sent a couple of men to go hunt in a forest, and these men went in the forest, but these men didn't come back. And then he sends another group of men to look for these men who disappeared in the forest, and these men too don't come back. And so it was understood at that time that you can't go into this forest, because if you go in there, you don't come back. And the story goes on to say, then a stranger then came looking for work, and he said to the king, King, what can I do for you? And the king said, well, thought of a few things, but one of the ideas that the stranger brought up was, I could then go into the forest and find those men. And the king said, no, you can't go there, because people who go there don't come back. The story goes on to say that the man goes in the forest, and whilst he's going into the forest, his dog disappears. A hand, in fact, comes from a river, and this hand steals his dog, or pulls his dog under the river. And so he goes back to the king. He says there's something at the bottom of the river. So they go, so they send a couple of men. They begin to bucket out the water from the river, because they want to see at the bottom what's happening at the bottom of the river. And once they did that, they find this hairy man, in which they go and put in a cage. So the story goes on to say that as they put this man in a cage, the king's son one day was playing with a ball. When he was playing with a ball, and the ball fell into the cage where this hairy man was, which they named Iron John, very hairy man whose name was Iron John. So the boy then asks Iron John, may I please have my ball back? And Iron John says, no, you can't. I can give you the ball, but give me the key. And the key was given to the king's wife, who she had put under the pillow. And so the boy says, I don't know where the key is, but I would like my ball, please. And Iron John says, I can give you a ball back if you get the key. So the boy goes and he figures it out, and he thinks about one day he steals the key. He steals the key from his mother's pillow, and he goes and he opens the cage for Iron John. And as he opening the cage for Iron John, he hurts his finger. And when he hurts his finger, he manages to open for Iron John now, but there was big trouble, because now he's released to this wild hairy man who lived at the bottom of the river. And what happens is that the boy says that I'm going to get in trouble, and Iron John says, live with me, let's escape together, because I've got these things that I can give you. And the boy goes on to that's the story of Iron John. But then Robert Bly uses this story to talk about a few ideas around manhood and masculinity. And one of the ideas he uses from the book, using anthropological views, mythological views, psychology views to kind of explain the story and to tease out themes around masculinity. One of the ideas he explores is this idea about the key being under the mother's pillow. The typical picture being how sometimes young men start changing towards their mother. That it's not strange to hear a mom say that, I had this sweet little boy, and when he started becoming a teenager, he changed. He changed all of a sudden. He doesn't speak so nicely to me. And Robert Bly kind of teases the idea that sometimes young boys make themselves ugly towards their mother because they realize that in them that there is something that they need to do on their own. And in South Africa, you'd be having conversations about, how come I raise this boy and all of a sudden he's telling me that he needs to find his father, that he's a man, that things he's going through that his mom doesn't understand, so there's that idea.